Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Rabbi Jeffrey Saks of Atid and WebYeshiva in our series of a history of halacha in 100 or so objects. When we're done with the series, we'll go back and revise whatever the number is. I doubt we'll get up to 100. Tonight, we are studying biblical blue, tchelet, the fascinating story of the disappearance and rediscovery of the biblical blue tchelet thread used in tzitzit, and we have the great privilege of a guest shiur from my friend and neighbor, Dr. Baruch Sturman, who was one of the people responsible for bringing us the tchelet back in our generation, and he'll tell us the story of how that happened. He is a PhD in physics. He's professionally involved in the world of high tech here in Israel, as well as taking part in a whole variety of different halachic adventures. He's one of the founders of the Amutat Ptil Tchelet, which you can visit at tchelet.com, which is the organization that's dedicated itself to spreading the practice of returning tchelet, returning tchelet to our strings of white on our tzitzit, as well as educating the Jewish world about this mitzvah. And he is the author of a fascinating book called The Rarest Blue, the remarkable story of an ancient color lost to history and rediscovered. We'll put up in the chat box a link to the book on Amazon, as well as to his own website and to the Ptil Tchelet website as well. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Baruch for our shiur, and you should all enjoy. Here we go.
Hi, Jeff. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Anyone wearing tchelet on their talit, and maybe you'll get 1, 2, 3, especially here in Israel. If you have a room of 100 people, you're going to get a handful of people who have never seen tchelet, and to me, that's an amazing transformation of the landscape within halacha. Because if I would have asked exactly that same question maybe 5 or 10 years ago, and certainly 15 or 20 years ago, then there would probably have not have been even one person who would have raised their hand. No one had ever seen tchelet up until just a decade or two ago. So this is really something that we've had the great privilege of being involved in, a complete transformation. We have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people nowadays who are wearing tchelet. So that's a great thing, but it makes it a little bit harder to put the story kind of in perspective, because the story is really about the loss and rediscovery of tchelet, but it kind of loses its punch after it's already been rediscovered. So nonetheless, it is a fascinating story. I hope you'll follow along with it, and I want to kind of address maybe 2 or 3 fundamental questions that I'd like to answer, and then if we can, I'll leave time for questions afterwards. The first question is, what did tchelet mean to the people who received the commandment in the Bible to wear tchelet? And we'll talk about that. And I'd like to just know what was tchelet. What did it mean to people in that time? And if we understand what tchelet was and what it meant to people all over the world, then maybe we'll be able to understand a little bit better what this commandment is to wear a string of tchelet on your garment. And the second question, of course, is how could it possibly have been that this mitzvah, this commandment, was lost? How did that come about? And then the third question is, why did it take so long to be rediscovered? What's the big deal? I mean, why was it so hard with all of the advances in science? Why did it take till essentially 1985? That's, you know, they discovered quantum mechanics and relativity way before people figured out what tchelet was, which is, you know, strange. So those are the questions I'd like to answer. So let's get right to it. Tchelet is mentioned for the first time in the Torah in Parshat Truma. Parshat Truma talks about the wonderful and beautiful things that were used in the tabernacle in the portable temple that was built by Moshe in the desert. And you have a list of precious metals, gold and silver and brass, very expensive metals, and parallel to that you have a list of very precious fabrics, tchelet, argaman, talat shani. For our purposes, we'll define that as blue and purple dyes and a crimson red dye. So just like you have this hierarchy, the most expensive metal is gold, and then afterwards comes silver and then brass, and so too in the fabrics, the most luxurious, desirable, beautiful, if you will, and possibly expensive of the dyes, of the dyed wool, was tchelet, and then afterwards the argaman, the purple and the red. Now, that's the first time that you see tchelet in the Torah and in Tanakh. The last time you see tchelet in Tanakh, at least chronologically, is probably in the times of Esther. And Mordechai, at the end of the story of the Megillah, walks out in royal clothes. Mordechai yatsa milifnei hamelech b'levush malchut. And what are those royal clothes? Tchelet. So let's try to put this in perspective, both chronologically in terms of the context of time and also in terms of the context of place. So from Egypt, the Jews in the desert, so they're right outside of Egypt, let's say sometime around the year 1300 BCE, when the Torah was given, 1313. So from the 14th century BCE, all the way through to when was Mordechai written, in the 3rd or 4th century in Persia. So let's take a look and see if we can see what we're talking about here. So we're talking about Egypt in this area, 1300 BCE, all the way over to here, the other end of the world, around 1,000 years at least later. And I can extend that even a little bit further, both in space and in time, if we're willing to go beyond just the Tanakh. And let's take a look and see if we can go back a little bit. So the first time that you find tchelet mentioned is actually in Egypt, in the Tel El Amarna letters, and these are going back all the way to the 1500 BCE. This is around the time of Avraham Avinu, just about what we're dealing with now in the Torah. And it's a present that was given from the princess of the Mitanni, which is in northern Syria, as she married the prince of Egypt. And so the Mechutanim were giving presents to each other, if you will. And there's a whole list of presents, and one of them is Sabatu Satakilti, Takilti. The word Tchelet there shows up even before the written Torah. So we're pushing it all the way to southern Egypt in Tel El Amarna, and we're pushing it back to 1500 BC, and you can even push it over, if you wanted to the island of Crete and the Minoan civilization, which is the first time that we ever have shellfish dyeing, the blues and the purples that come from these snails. And all the way through, as we'll see, the end of the Talmud around the year 600. So that's a very, very long time, and it's a very wide area. And the reason that I say this and why I'm pointing this out is because if you want to say that this was something tchelet that only belonged to the Jewish people, or that there was some very, very secret recipe that only the Jews knew about, well, that's very difficult to say. Tchelet is used in so many contexts, with so many different civilizations, over such a long period of time, more than 2,000 years, 2,500 years. So it's very, very hard to say anything specific that, you know, only the Jews knew how to do this, or only the Israelites at this particular time and space. Everything is going to have to be a clue. This is a giant CSI episode of how we can find tchelet that was lost. Tchelet was murdered, and we have to figure out what happened to it. So everything is a clue. And just the fact that it was around over such a wide area and for such a long time is also a clue. Now, another thing which is a clue is the fact that in the 59 times or so that tchelet is mentioned throughout Tanakh, never once does the Torah say what tchelet is. It doesn't say tchelet and it comes from this particular animal or this species or how it's died or anything like that. It just says tchelet. And that's also an important clue, because if the Torah didn't have to tell everybody what it was, it means that it was obvious. So for those times that tchelet are mentioned all across the thousands of years and thousands of miles, everyone knew what tchelet was. And that's going to be important for us as well. So what we do know from the Tanakh, of course, is that tchelet was fabulously expensive. That's what kings wore. Tchelet was worn by the high priest. Tchelet was adorned the walls and the curtains of the temple. And so it was an extremely precious article. And so when the Torah tells us, the commandment that every Jew should place a string of tchelet on their garment, well, what would that have meant to the person who heard this? And I think that we can talk about maybe the color of tchelet was blue, and that would remind them of something, but that gets away from the simplest idea, which is that it was just very, very, very expensive. It was something that people guarded, and that when someone would see anybody wearing it, it would immediately strike them as a very precious article of clothing, a sign that this person was in some way connected to royalty. And indeed, that's what the Jew was meant to feel. The Jew was meant to feel that he was an Eved Hashem, a servant of God, a priest serving God. And yes, every single Jew was a priest. The Jewish people, each and every Jew is considered a priest in the service of God. And that was the most immediate thing I think that people would have picked up on. And so I think that's just a plain and simple meaning. Then you'll see that string of tchelet. It's just like a uniform. If you see a fireman, you know exactly what that fireman's job is and what they do, and so a policeman or whoever else it is. When you saw the Jew wearing tchelet, when the Jew would see himself wearing tchelet, then he would be reminded of his function. And what is his function? Of course, to serve God. Okay, so that's a very, very beautiful and lofty idea. So how could it possibly be, if this mitzvah, this commandment is so important and so meaningful? In fact, the Talmud says, Shkula mitzvah tzitzit kineged kol mitzvot shebetorah. The mitzvah of tzitzit, the commandment to wear these tzitzit, was equal to all of the other commandments put together. Now, that may be hyperbole, but it definitely shows it indicates something about what people what Chazal, what our rabbis thought about the mitzvah of tzitzit, about the commandment of tzitzit. So how could it possibly have been lost? We would never imagine that tefillin could be lost. We'd never imagine that lulav and etrog or matzah or any of the other accoutrements of our religious life could be lost. And so how could it possibly have been that tchelet could have been lost? And the answer, I believe, starts and ends, I guess, with the fact that it really, really was very, very, very expensive. Okay, so if it was very expensive, then that means that a couple of things. First of all, it meant that the impoverished Jewish community would have had a hard time getting tchelet and wearing it. So not everybody wore tchelet, and there are indications already in the Talmud that few people wore tchelet, and it was really something that was very special, and only the privileged class at one point were able to allow themselves to wear tchelet. But the fact that tchelet was fabulously expensive, we know from outside sources that it was worth at one time 20 times its weight in gold. That's very, very expensive. And as with everything, if something is expensive and there's money to be made, then the people who have power will want to take control over that industry. They'll want to take control so that they can make the money. Also, they want to take control so that this very, very beautiful thing will represent a certain stature, a certain class, and they want to keep that for themselves, and that's what happened with tchelet. And so we find kind of all along, wars were fought in this area, in our area of Israel. Wars were fought over who would control the tchelet dyeing industry, the purple and the blues. And Julius Caesar, at one point, only allows the returning general to wear the toga picta, which was a beautiful purple gown embroidered in gold. Only the triumphant general could wear that. But it gets even worse as you go along. And ultimately, all the dye houses came under imperial control in Roman times. And in fact, it became actually very, very dangerous to be involved with tchelet and to wear tchelet. So let me show you something. This is the, can we make this a little bigger? How do we do that? I'm not sure if you can all read this, but I'll read.
On the bar at the top, there's a plus and a minus sign.
Oh, I see. Okay, there you go. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to read from the Codex of Theodosius the Emperor in the 5th century. And Theodosius writes, all persons of whatsoever sex, rank, skill, or profession shall abstain from the possession of those materials that the emperor himself is wearing, namely purple and purple dye. Now, purple meant all of the different colors in the purple family, which included blue and tchelet, and we'll see that actually specifically in a second. But what's important to point out is, let no man, oh, this is the wrong way. Let me turn this into yellow. Hold on. There we go. Let no man, by such a concealment, meaning you can't have any tchelet in your house, otherwise he shall sustain the danger of involvement in a crime similar to high treason. And a few years later, Justinian puts it quite succinctly in his codex, where he says, the bottom line is, nobody has the right to dye or sell purple cloth or wool called, any of the colors called blada or oxyblada, those are types of purple, or hyacinthina, which is blue, that's tchelet. If anyone should sell these dyed wools, let him know that he risks losing his property and his head. So that's not something that you wanted to get involved with. And in fact, we actually have echoes of this in the Gemara itself. let's see if we can jump to page 9. Okay. Okay. There is a story in the Gemara, in the Talmud in Sanhedrin, where tchelet is being smuggled from Israel to Babylonia. Why didn't they have it in Babylonia? Why did they have to smuggle it from Israel? Well, tchelet was made with from the dye of a sea snail. We'll talk about that in just one second. So if it was, it needed to be a sea snail that came from the Mediterranean Ocean, in the Mediterranean Sea. So it was only produced in Israel, and it was smuggled into Bavel. And Rava had two boys who were smuggling tchelet to him. Tafsu nesher, the eagle caught them, and in their hands were things that were made with luz, and that's tchelet. So they come from Reket, which is Tiberia, and they're going to Bavel. They're smuggling tchelet, and and by some sort of a miracle that they were worthy of happening, they escaped in peace. So you see that it was very, very dangerous, and these are exactly the same time that Theodosius and Justinian are writing. So we have this parallel between the codices, which forbid people to work with tchelet, and then of course the Gemara on the other side, which talks about how Jews were still risking their lives to work with tchelet. And this coin is really an amazing coin. This is a Roman eagle, right? The eagle that caught these two boys that were smuggling tchelet. And between the eagle's talons, if you can see, is a very nice, can you see what I'm circling there? That is a sea snail, and that sea snail is what I have in my hands here. It's a Murex sea snail, right? I'll hold it up exactly as the eagle is holding it up. And it really is absolutely amazing that we have a picture, pretty much, of what the ancient source of the dye is, at least according to the theory that we're going to propose here. Okay, so that's part of the story of how tchelet was lost. When exactly was tchelet lost? Well, we don't know for sure, but we do have a little bit of an indication. The last time we ever hear of tchelet is just about at the end of the Babylonian Talmud. A certain Mar Mimashchi was still dealing with tchelet, and this is really the end of the Babylonian Talmud. Mar Mimashchi, at least according to Rav Herzog, was one of the Savoraim, so he's very, very late. And then at 720, we have the Midrash that says 720, 750, the Tanchuma, and now the Achshav Ein Lanu Ela Lavan She'atchelet Nignaz. We no longer have tchelet, it's gone anymore, it's gone, and all we have is white. What happened between Mar Mimashchi in the 6th century and in the 8th century when we don't have tchelet anymore? Well, what we can surmise, and this is again Rav Herzog's proposal, is that you had an incredible century of upheaval in Israel in the 7th century. And you have Jerusalem conquered some 17 times in 40 years, a ridiculous time of turmoil for the Jews who live in Israel. And especially by the end, by 640, 638, the Arab conquest of Israel. And you can imagine that, remember, all these dye houses are under Roman imperial control, and they're making tons of money. And all of that money is going towards the war effort, the Byzantine Romans against the Arabs. So when the Arabs finally did conquer this area, well, the first thing that they would do is destroy anything that had to do with Rome, especially these dye houses, which were so lucrative and so important to the Roman war effort. and they did, and so we can assume, and that's probably what happened is in terms of the end of Tchelet. So we do have some clues from the Gemara. The Gemara talks about the source of Tchelet. Now, I mentioned that in Tanakh, we never know what Tchelet was made of or where it came from. But in the Gemara, we do. It comes from a chilazon. So anybody here who speaks Hebrew knows what a chilazon is. But people kind of didn't really, over the 1,300 years that Tchelet was lost, there were all kinds of suggestions, what exactly it meant. I've heard people say it was some kind of a lizard. We'll talk maybe about the Radziner Rebbe, who thought it was a certain kind of a squid. Nowadays, it's and in a simple way, and even according to many people all throughout the period, Rishonim and Achronim, it meant a snail. What kind of snail? Not clear. There are some other hints that we have about Tchelet, important things, like, for example, it was the color of indigo. There was a fraudulent Tchelet that was going around during the times of Chazal and in the times of the Mishnah and Talmud, and it was a fake Tchelet, and it came from the indigo plant. Let's just see if we have this here. I think I do. Yeah. So Kala Ilan was fake Tchelet, and Kala Ilan was indigo. It came from one of two sources. Either on your left here, you see this is the indigo fera plant, and it's called indigo because it came from India and China. It reached Israel around the time of the Second Temple. So Tchelet had been already well entrenched, and Tchelet was being made from sea snails. But this cheaper indigo was coming in, and it clearly wasn't authentic, and people didn't really want to use it if they wanted the real thing. And the Gemara, of course, warns that nobody is allowed to wear Kala Ilan and think that they're keeping the mitzvah of Tchelet. That's a very bad thing. And because it was so difficult to tell the difference between them, so Chazal really had to make an appeal to a higher authority to make sure that people were not going to use this fraudulent Tchelet. And they do so by raining curses down on the head of anybody who pretends that Kala Ilan is Tchelet, and God will exact his wrath from those people who cheat others and sell this fake Tchelet and pretend that it's real Tchelet. So in the middle, actually, you see this beautiful Chinese letter. And why is that in the middle of a talk about Tchelet? Well, it ends up that Rav Herzog, I keep mentioning Rav Herzog, and I'll talk about him a little bit more. And the reason why he's so interesting and exciting for this story is because he wrote a doctorate in 1914 on Tchelet. And he asks the question, what exactly does the word Kala Ilan mean? Where did it come from? And he makes a suggestion. Rav Herzog was quite amazing. He knew and spoke some 12 languages, and he loved languages. And he suggests that Kala Ilan came from the Chinese, the ancient Chinese word Kitlan. And this is the letter for Kitlan. What it is a picture of a bowl of water and some symbols above it. So it could very well be that, and this is the symbol for indigo. So Chinese indigo was called Kilan, and this may have meant the reflection of the sky in a bowl of water, not clear exactly. But anyway, that's Kala Ilan. On the left-hand side, the indigo fera plant. On the right-hand side is woad, which was also a source of indigo, and that was a little bit more rampant, more well-known in Israel. It was grown in Israel and especially in Europe. So these were the fake things. So now what this tells us, though, is that if we can find something which looks like indigo, well, then we found something that looks like real Tchelet, because if the fraudulent Tchelet was this indigo, then it must have looked pretty similar. And again, no one could tell the difference. Only God could tell the difference between someone who was wearing Kala Ilan and somebody who was wearing Tchelet. Flash. Now we're gonna move fast forward, maybe 1,300 years, and we're in the 1800s. And Tchelet has been gone already for at least 1,000 years, and maybe even 1,200 or 1,300 years. And there is a small group of people who start to become interested in tchelet again. And this small group of people start writing about maybe we could find tchelet and even go searching for tchelet. And you wonder why all of a sudden, after all of these years where tchelet was gone, did people start thinking about tchelet? I think the answer is that these were the beginnings of the stirrings of Zionism. The early Zionists were religious, and there was this feeling in the air that the Jews would soon be coming home to their homeland, back to Israel, and returning to the Promised Land. And for a religious Zionist, well, that meant that once again we would be able to build the temple, and of course in the temple we would be able to practice the sacrifices and do all of the avodah, all the service in the temple. But there is one hitch, and that is that you're not allowed to do any of those services in the temple unless you have the bigdei kehuna, the garments of the priest, and especially the garments of the high priest. And of course, those garments required tchelet. So all of this business of the Jews returning to their homeland and building the temple, well, all of that is really going to come to a dead end, and you're going to reach a brick wall as soon as you get to the fact that there is no tchelet. So people started thinking about how one could find tchelet again, and we'll see that in a second. Well, okay, so by this time, people knew that chilazon meant snail, and we're talking about it, pretty sophisticated scientists. So couldn't anybody figure out what it was? There were all these hints in the Talmud, and not only in the Talmud. Pliny, the elder, the ancient Roman scientists and naturalists. Aristotle wrote about this. Vitruvius. You have quite an abundance of information that certainly should have been enough to give people a good hint as to what tchelet was and what it came from and where it came from. So in order to understand why it was so difficult to reinstitute and to find tchelet again, you have to follow through one of the greatest misdirections, we'll say it like that, of tchelet research. And it starts with a Dutch Hebraicist, a Christian scholar by the name of Wilhelm Gesenius. Wilhelm Gesenius wrote a dictionary translating Hebrew words from the Bible, from the Tanakh, into Latin. And, of course, when he got to the word tchelet, he translated it and explained what it was. And here you can see in Latin, for those of you who speak Latin, he says, helix yantenai. Let me see why this doesn't happen here. Helix yantenai, which is a type of snail. Helix is a certain type of snail, a murex. And then he says, it's a species, right, in Mare Mediterraneano, right, it's in the Mediterranean Sea. And then he says, testa violecia, which means that its color is violet, purple. So Gesenius in the early 1800s is writing about tchelet, and he tells you it comes from a sea snail, and that sea snail is in the Mediterranean, and the color of the dye that comes out of the sea snail is purple. Okay, so Gesenius actually was widely read by many Jews, including Rabbi Israel Lifshitz, who is at Tiferet Yisrael, for any of you who have seen a fundamental commentator on the Mishnah. And here he talks in a small monograph that he has on the clothes of the priests. Here he talks about tchelet. And he says, and I'll read together with you here, Uche'ein zeh katav Gesenius, and so writes Gesenius, right? Shatchelet naseh midam mushal. That tchelet comes from a mussel, from a snail, hanikret, which is called purpurschneck. Anybody speak Yiddish, you'll know that a schneck in German is a snail. So he's quoting Gesenius, and he says, this snail, the purple snail, sovin midamo, purple blue, no violet. Okay, so Gesenius told us that this snail gives a violet color. And also he says, shenintzad b'yam ha'emtzai, it's found in the Mediterranean, and so on and so forth. Okay. And then he says, however, the fact that it is found in the Mediterranean, emet, that's true. Kachivil Chazal, so our rabbis have told us. Omnam, and this is the key, b'ma shekatav, what Gesenius writes, that this snail gives a purple blue, right, a violet, dunkel blue. But there he says, lo nishmalo, we cannot listen to Gesenius. That's not according to our tradition. Shelo ki kabbalatenu. Because Chazal said tchelet is the color of the sky, domelu rakia. And so says the Rambam. And so he says, tchelet must be himmelblau, sky blue. Therefore, what Gesenius wrote, this snail, Shehizkir Gesenius, is not the correct snail, and therefore it cannot be used for tchelet. And this was the beginning of 130 years that went down this path. The belief was, and this was confirmed again later on by Rav Herzog, that you have snails in the Mediterranean, these snails, murex snails, but the problem is that these snails produce, I don't know if you can see it so well, but produce a purple dye. This purple that I'm holding in my hand was dyed with the secretions that come out of these snails. And so there you go. Now, as time went on, more and more evidence began to mount that these snails, the murex snails, were in fact the chilazon that the Gemara, that the Talmud was talking about, and that were used in ancient times for dyeing. There were the archaeological surveys of the 1800s and early 1900s, all over Israel, all over Syria and Lebanon, where they found mounds and mounds of these broken shells that clearly proved that there was a dye industry in ancient times that used these snails. Okay, but as they went on, again, anything that was found always had purple. So you have the snail, and it's purple. What do? If this is the snail that gives tchelet, but this is not the color of tchelet, so you're left at an impasse. And as I mentioned before, Rav Herzog in his doctorate of 1914, which the title of which was Hebrew Porphyrology, or the study of purple. That's a word that he invented. The study of purple, Hebrew Porphyrology and ancient Israel, tchelet in ancient Israel. So he was never able to get past this problem. And in fact, not only wasn't he able to get past this problem, but it got worse. He had, at one point, a relationship with a great dye chemist by the name of Paul Friedlander. And Paul Friedlander was the greatest chemist of his time. He had studied the molecules that these snails give and actually definitively found the structure and the compounds that made them up. So he was a great chemist, and Rabbi Herzog had a relationship with him, and he actually sent him some samples of a different dye, the Radzinu dye, not important for our purposes. And Paul Friedlander wrote back to him as follows: two things. Thing number one, he said, Rabbi, snails give purple. That's all you're going to find. So if you're thinking that you're going to find blue from a snail, it ain't going to happen. The second thing that Paul Friedlander wrote back to him was, and this is very strange, Rabbi, There is no blue dye that exists on this planet that is naturally formed that comes from anything other than the plants that give indigo. Those plants, the indigofera plant or woad, will give you a molecule, indigo, and that's a blue dye. Nothing else exists that we know of on this planet that can do that. So Rabbi Herzog is really, really in a quandary here now. You have snails where you have more and more evidence that these snails are the true snails that gave tchelet. They're all giving this purple dye. And Rav Herzog died in 1959, never being able to solve this problem. Tchelet was dear to him his whole life, but never was he able to come to it. On the one hand, he certainly respected the scientists who were saying that these snails are, in fact, the source of ancient tchelet. On the other hand, he was not willing to give up the tradition that tchelet was sky blue. Now, a lesser man may have just, kind of said, okay, well, tchelet was lost for so long, maybe our tradition is not accurate. Maybe it really was purple. That would have been an easy thing to do, but Rav Herzog could not do that. He couldn't give up the fact that the tradition had maintained that it was this himmel blue, and so he was left without any answers. The answer came only after Rav Herzog passed away, and the answer came in 1985 by a scientist by the name of Otto Elsner. I think I may even have a picture of him here. That's just to point out. That is Rav Herzog. He was an amazing, amazing man. We don't have enough time to go into everything about him, but he was really just amazing. The answer came, as I mentioned, in 1985. This is Professor Otto Elsner. And Professor Otto Elsner actually was paid by a billionaire from America to do research into these snails, and that's a very interesting story in of itself. Why is some rich chemist in Chattanooga, Tennessee, funding snail research, ancient dyeing methods? You can read about it in the book. Otto Elsner is doing his research, and one of the things that you can't see on a PowerPoint demonstration or over WebEx, at least not yet, is the incredible smell that dyeing has. And we know about that even from our own sources. If a woman marries someone, they're all happy and getting along fine, and then that person becomes a dyer, well, she's allowed to sue for divorce. So that's how bad it is to come home every night smelling of dye. And Professor Elsner, when he did his work in his laboratory in the Shenkar College of Fibers in Ramat Gan, well, the people who worked with him had typical Israeli chutzpah, and even though Professor Elsner was the head of his department, they basically kicked him out of the laboratory and said that they could not stand the smell of what he was working on. And then indeed, Professor Elsner, doing his work outside in the parking lot of the Shenkar College of Fibers, broke his snails open and found that they actually dyed this purple dye. But that was only on cloudy days. On sunny days, in fact, he got a beautiful blue, sky blue color from the snail, and basically cracked open the riddle of how tchelet could indeed come from a snail. And so what we're going to do now, just very, very quickly, is a tiny little chemistry lesson.
Baruch, before you move on to the chemistry, there are one or two questions that came in the chat box, if you see that underneath the participants. Earlier, Anne had asked about when we were discussing the disappearance of the tchelet, but didn't the emperors keep a source of it for themselves?
Yes. Yes, that's a great question. But don't forget that we're talking about a very, very long period of time. So there's also something else that I want to, there's a lot of components to your answer, to answering your question. Part of it is the fact that time moved on, as did science and commerce for the rest of the world. So if there was this cheaper indigo that was available, well, people started using it and they had no reason not to use it.
Including the royalty.
The authentic dye was still tchelet, but, you know, more and more that started to be replaced by indigo, and a mix of indigo and kermes could get you purple. Of course, for the Jews, that was not acceptable, because the Tosefta says, and the Halacha is clear, tchelet min achilazon kasher. Only tchelet that comes from achilazon is acceptable. Hevi shelo min achilazon pasul. So the Jews had this problem that they could only use this authentic dye. And that was part of it. The other part of it is that as the dye houses were raised by the Arabs as they went up the coast, well, the dye just simply wasn't available. It wasn't available for the Roman emperors as well as for the Jews, and it was lost not only to the Jewish people; it was lost to all of history. This is one of the great mysteries of of all time. What this ancient Tyrian purple and royal blue, biblical blue, was. So it was not just for the Jews; it was everybody. It was lost to everybody.
And there's another question that came in from Tehila Leah, which you might be about to address in the chemistry lesson, which is why not expect that the dye needed compounding the same way, she writes, the same way that perfume needs compounding?
Well, yes, and that's exactly what we're going to find out. But, you know, just to point out, the history of chemistry is essentially the search for dyes. Everything else we've found out along the way is just accidental. Dyes are very, very, very rare in nature, and up until Perkin in the late 1800s, when he invented synthetic dyes, you really had it was very, very hard to find a dye. And the reason is because a dye, as opposed to a stain, will never wash out. It's a beautiful color, but there are a lot of things that have beautiful colors, like beautiful marbles or stones, right? But if you put them on a shirt, they're not going to do anything, because and then again, if you have something like wine and you dip your shirt in wine, well, it may have a beautiful color when it comes out, but it's not going to stay for a long time. It'll wash out, especially with detergents. Maybe it'll fade in the sun. So a dye never changes. What the Rambam says about tchelet, for example, she'omedet biofya velo tshtaneh. It will stay beautiful and never change. That's one of the characteristics of tchelet. So the problem with a dye is it's almost an oxymoron, because if it doesn't bond to water and detergent, how are you going to get it to bond to the shirt? And that's why dyes are so rare in nature. You have to trick them somehow or another. If you can find a molecule that's also beautiful and can also be tricked into attaching itself to a fabric, well, you're going to make a lot of money off of it. So very, very rare. So let me just explain now, if I can, with just a brief animation, what exactly is going on in Otto Elsner's discovery. The snail actually produces 3 molecules that are dyes. Dibromo-indigo, which has a deep purple, monobromo-indigo, which is a little bit less purple, and indigo. And so all 3 dyes are obtained in different measures from the murex snail. Okay. In a typical murex snail, you're going to find that there's an abundance of dibromo-indigo, the darker purple, a little bit of monobromo-indigo, and a small amount of indigo. And that mix is going to give you the purple, actually exactly this purple that I showed you before. It's actually a picture of this piece of wool. And that comes from a snail. Now, if there were a way to change that concentration a little bit, where we had more indigo and a lot less of the dibromo-indigo and monobromo-indigo, well, then we would get the blue of tchelet. And in fact, there is such a way to do that. So if you start with a dibromo-indigo molecule, and it's basically indigo with 2 bromines attached to the end, and the same is true for the monobromo-indigo, the 1 indigo. In order to get this into the water, it doesn't dissolve in liquids. It doesn't dissolve in water. It's very, very inert, which is why it's a good dye, right? But we have to trick it into bonding with water in order to dye with it. And the way you do that is a chemical trick called reduction. It actually adds a charge to the two oxygen atoms, and that charge is something that allows you to bond to water. You have to do this if you're going to dye with any of these indigos. Okay, so in ancient times they had to do it. We know how to do it today with chemicals. We also know how to do it with ancient methods like fermentation. We're not exactly sure how they did it, but one thing we know for sure is they had to do it in ancient times. Okay, now in that state, and only in that state, it's a very, very short time. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks to cultivate this. And then you dip it and dye it, and then you're done with it. So now you're going to have it in this reduced state. At that point, exposure to ultraviolet light will break the bonds of the bromine. The bromine is gone, it can evaporate. And then what you're left with, upon oxidation again, removing that charge and getting back to the core molecule, is an indigo molecule. So we found now that tchelet and kala ilan are virtually identical. In fact, they really are, at least as far as the color goes, really exactly the same. It's true that in every tchelet, you're also going to find a little dibromo indigo and a little monobromo indigo. You're definitely going to find that. But to the eye, the most important color in that mixture is going to be indigo, and it's going to look exactly like kala ilan, just like the Talmud told us. So that's pretty much the story of tchelet. In 1985, Otto Elsner wrote about this incredible discovery in the Journal of the Society of Oriental Dyers, and he spoke about it just outside of Tokyo. And you can imagine that that audience must have been filled with rabbis and yeshiva bachrim. Not. So really nobody actually knew about Otto Elsner's discoveries in the world of Torah and its application to tchelet, really. That happened over the next few years. A few people had heard about this and started publicizing it. Dr. Zeiderman, Israel Zeiderman, Rabbi Bezalel Naor, and eventually a young rabbi, a student really, Rabbi Eliyahu Tevger, heard about this and decided that he was going to la'asot ma'aseh, to do something about it. He went down to the sea, collected the snails, broke them open. After a tremendous effort, a lot of wasted money and time, he was eventually able to dye one set of tchelet, which he wore on his talit, and that was the first set of tchelet that was worn. 1989 was the first set of tchelet that was worn since the time of Marmi Mashchi and Rav Achai, 1300 years previous. We joined with him because Eliyahu was looking for scuba divers to help him find some snails. So a few people, myself, Joel Guberman, and Ari Greenspan, we joined with him a year or two later, scuba diving with him to help him find more snails, and we became completely obsessed with this idea of tchelet and with the fact that we needed to bring tchelet back to the Jewish people. And so from that first day on the beach where we were able to find something like 293 snails, we've developed now an organization which produces upwards of 20,000 sets of tchelet a year. And as I mentioned, I think that you can find in every corner of the globe, from Melbourne, Australia, to Oslo, to Nashville, Tennessee, and even in Hawaii. And I do know of somebody actually in Japan. And everywhere in between, you can find people that are wearing tchelet. And that's an amazing, amazing thing. You know, people speak about halacha, and halacha changes, it doesn't change. It's a big argument. It changes too fast, it's changing too slow, it doesn't change at all. Well, I can at least say one thing. Over the last 25 years, this is really like a seismic shift in a fundamental law. it didn't exist, and now it exists for 200,000 or almost 300,000 people who are wearing tchelet. Some of them great rabbis, Orthodox, Haredi, Reform, anything. It's really a completely democratic and across the spectrum of the Jewish people from all over the world and from every walk of life. So it really is an unbelievable privilege to be involved in this and to really devote much of my day and really my life. It's our house is a house of tchelet. You know, people are dropping off their talitot all the time. All of my children know how to tie tchelet. We'll have tchelet emergencies where somebody comes on the way to a wedding and they forgot that the talit needs tchelet, and I'll have my kids come down. Everybody takes a corner, and we can be in and out within 5 minutes. We can get you up and running with tchelet. So it really is an amazing zchut, an amazing merit to be involved in this.
Why don't you take a look at the chat box? There are a few questions that have come in, or of course people are welcome to speak up on the microphone if you'd like.
Can the dye be harvested without killing the snails? It's such a good question, and it's a question that unfortunately today the answer is no. But there are tribes in Mexico, in the Oaxaca region, who have similar snails, and they have developed a technique of what they call milking the snail, where they irritate the snail a little bit, and the secretion that comes out is something that they can press against the wool, and they can use that to dye. The only problem is it takes basically an entire lifetime to make one scarf, and it's actually a very beautiful tradition. They give that scarf over to the eldest daughter when she gets married. So it really is a beautiful tradition, but not something that you could do to mass-produce tzitzit. I do very, very much hope that the technology will improve and that we'll be able one day to figure out how to do this without killing the snails. But it's something that the Talmud already knows. I'm sorry?
How stable is the snail population?
That we don't have a problem with right now. We get our snails right now from Croatia, and the reason we don't get them from Israel is that they're protected in Israeli coastal waters. But in Croatia, we have absolutely no problem. We're fishing two small, tiny little regions of Croatia, and the fishermen are just pushing us to have more and more snails. Just to give you some kind of a context, snails are pretty similar, I would guess, to abalone. And I think the consumption of abalone in the world is something like 20 to 40 metric tons a year. And if we were to give every single Jew tchelet once a year, we think that we would need no more than 5 metric tons. So we think that we're okay, at least in the short term, but we are doing research together with Professor Zeiderman, Dr. Zeiderman, to figure out how we might be able to breed these snails in the future. I just want to point out that the Gemara knew very much that you had to kill the snails, and in fact, that's one of the proofs that the murex was the snail that the Gemara was talking about. The Gemara says, if you take a snail and you break it open to get its dye on Shabbat, then you transgress the melacha, the activity of killing, of nitilat neshama. And then the Gemara goes on to say, but you don't want to kill it. You want to keep it alive as long as possible because that makes the dye better. And in fact, that's actually true. The dye has to come from a snail that is alive or just very, very, very recently killed. So this is something that the Gemara talked about and knew about. Let's see what other questions we have. Is it still expensive? Well, it used to be worth 20 times its weight in gold. I can say proudly that the price has come down since then. These are the packages that we sell them in. I see it, if you can see. This is a typical set of tchelet. It's 4 strings and all the white strings. And it goes for somewhere in the area of about $50. Considering the fact that this took close to 60 snails to make these strings and all of the work involved, it's something that is expensive, because I think that that's part of the mitzvah. Part of the mitzvah is that it was an expensive thing, and that's part of the understanding of why and how it goes. But we're trying to bring the price down as much as we possibly can. We sell a short version of the tchelet for $30, and that is actually, I hope, very, very reasonable. You're not going to get as long strings, but they're still completely kosher. And let me see if there's any genetically engineered bacteria to produce indigos. Huh. Very interesting question. A question that's, I think, above, shall we say, my pay grade in terms of halacha. It would be an interesting question. As I mentioned before, the Tiferet Yisrael was very involved in this, and he actually believed that synthetic dyes would be kosher for tchelet if they had the right characteristics. Everybody disagreed with him. Everybody disagreed with him, but nonetheless, he was a great rabbi, and he had that opinion. So who knows? Maybe one day. A lot of the other questions are about farming, and yes, we do want to be able to farm. It's not a trivial thing, because if you wanted to farm fish, then it has to do with volume. You just dig a big hole, and the more water you can put in there, the more fish you can have. But snails need surface area. They need to be on some kind of a land or sand or something like that. So if we were to raise them, we'd have to kind of build snail apartment buildings, if you will. So it might be a little bit tricky to do in terms of the space. But absolutely. So as you can see, there's just a tremendous amount of work that still needs to be done, and we're really just at the beginning of tchelet research. And I hope that we'll have a lot more information for you as we go along. And more important than that, I hope that we have another generation of people who decide to take this upon themselves, get doctorates in snail science and tchelet science, and that would be just a wonderful thing to be able to push this forward in every way possible.
Baruch, maybe say a word about, or you can show on the screen demonstrations, a word about the different opinions about how the tchelet should be tied. We should just mention, in case there are people that don't understand, when we talk about the ptil tchelet, the tzitzit string, each of the corners of the talit or the talit katan has a set of 4 doubled over strings, and there are different opinions about which string is the blue and how it's tied and how the knots are formed. So say a word about kind of navigating that halachic question, that even if we know what the tchelet is, what the dye is, the question of how it should be affixed to the tzitzit.
So here you see, actually it's on the screen. I don't have to hold it in my hand. There. See, the problem is that halacha usually goes through this kind of evolution. The Talmud, in very broad strokes, the Talmud kind of puts out these general principles. The next generation, the Rishonim, if you will, organize these principles into practical methods, right? And then over, you may have many opinions there, and then you go through this natural selection over the next 1,000 or so years of different communities accepting different opinions, and so you weed away just by attrition most of the opinions, and you're left with 1 or 2 or 3 ways of doing things within halacha. Well, tchelet stopped 1,300 years ago, so it's basically almost, if you will, a halachic fossil. You have the opinions of all of these Rishonim that try to make sense out of the Talmud, out of the Gemara, but you don't have any natural selection over 1,000 years to determine which method is the one that's most widely accepted. And so you're left with all of these different opinions. You have the opinion here on this side. This is the opinion of the Rambam, who believed that there should be 1 out of 8 strings, a half a string that gets folded over and turns into tchelet, and he had different people understand him differently as to how he actually tied that 1 string. And then here you have, on this side, all of these different methods which alternate blue and white in some way or form. The Shita of the Grav, the Vilna Gaon, and the Sefer HaChinuch, and Rav Amram Gaon, and so on. And their opinion is that there should be two. One full string that when it gets folded over with the other 4 strings, you get 2 out of 8 strings that are tchelet, and then Tosfot and Rashi believe that they should be even 2 and 2 or 4 and 4. So it's pretty daunting when somebody kind of comes and finally makes a decision and says, "Okay, I'm going to wear tchelet now," and then they get struck by this, and it's kind of they get stuck in the headlights, kind of. Oh, now what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to wear this? What am I supposed to wear? And you'll go and ask a rabbi, and the rabbi doesn't really know, and nobody knows, because these are to a certain extent. You could try to make sense out of it and say, well, if maybe I should do Tosfot, if maybe I should do Rambam, because for whatever halachic reason. On the other hand, you could take a completely different approach, and there's certainly a very, very strong aesthetic component to wearing tchelet. It is beautiful. And some people just say, you know what, look at all of these different ways of wearing tchelet, and whatever strikes you as the most beautiful, whatever is the one that you think is really something that catches the eye and catches your eye, well, that's the way to do it. So there are different opinions on how you can kind of navigate all of these different ways of making tchelet, of wearing tchelet.
What's the most widespread custom? If somebody comes to your organization to buy a pair of tchelet and says, well, you be my rabbi, what's the most common custom? Which position should I follow? What is recommended to them?
Okay, so Rabbi Tevger, Eliyahu Tevger, who is again the one who really is our posek, our arbiter, he feels that we should follow this opinion, which is the Sefer HaChinuch. And the reason he likes that is, first of all, because it does make sense with most of the Gemaras. Nothing makes perfect sense according to all of the different opinions in the Talmud. But this comes close to...
We're Jewish. We wouldn't, expect anything else.
Exactly. And he also likes the fact that you have 5 knots, and it looks a little bit similar to some of the tzitzit that people still wear today, the 7, 8, 11, and 13. On the other hand, this is also a very, very popular way of wearing it, and it's becoming more and more popular. And I would say that between the Rambam, which we call 13, this is the way the Teimanim, the Yemenite community, still wear, till this day, their tchelet their tzitzit in white with these very special and beautiful knots. Let's see if we can kind of zoom in on it a little bit. You can actually see these are just really special, some of these ways of tying. So the Yemenites still wear this to this day, and this has become a very popular way of wearing tchelet. And I would say that you probably have also a close cousin to the chinuch is its next door neighbor here, the Gra. Also very, very similar, almost identical. I would say about 70 to 80% of the tchelet that we sell and that we know that's tied is one of these 3 methods. Either chinuch and gra, maybe that makes up 40, 50%, and then another 20, 25% is Rambam. So these are the 3 most popular methods, but they're not the only methods, and even these that I've shown here. If I had to show all of the different methods that I've seen in my days of doing tchelet, I would have to show probably altogether, maybe I've seen 30 different ways of tying tchelet. And every once in a while, somebody surprises me with another way. So there is room for innovation in halacha, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Well, I really want to thank you, Baruch, for this really fascinating story of halachic adventure and halachic discovery on such a central mitzvah to the Jewish people. Again, I really recommend to everyone, I can't recommend it highly enough, Baruch's book, The Rarest Blue. There again in the chat is a link to the book on Amazon. It's such a fascinating story, and we really only pardon the puns, we really only dipped our toes into it tonight. One of the fascinating things about the book is that it ties together so many varied disciplines and fields of knowledge and science and literature and culture and history and philosophy and everything from spectrographics to Rav Herzog, from how it intersects the history of Zionism to the story of ancient Rome, and it pulls everything together. It as I punned, there's a thread that runs through all of these topics, and it of course is a thread of blue. So I really can't recommend the book highly enough. It's incredibly well written and a fascinating story, and what you and your friends have been doing with the Amutat Patil Tchelet is fascinating as well. And all of us at Web Yeshiva, thank you. I just want to let all of you folks online know that we hope that some point in the future, Dr. Sturman and his crew will launch some kind of ongoing course here at Web Yeshiva, which will be this kind of adventure in Torah and Mad'a, the intersection of Torah study with worldly wisdom, in order to study this and other topics. So stay tuned for that. This has been a coming attraction for what we hope will be a new series. Our regular course will continue next week, and thank you all. We're going to cut off the recorder now, but Baruch, if you want to stay around and answer people's questions, you're welcome to, and thanks all.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.